Cleopatra stood barefoot. The silk of her dress barely rustled in the wind, but she didn't move. Her eyes were wide open like temple doors. In this silence, where even the fountains had stopped, she listened to herself. There, inside, in her chest, anxiety beat. Not from an enemy, not from Rome, not from rumors. It was different, primal, like a mother's fear for an unborn child. She didn't know what she was waiting for, but she knew. Today, everything would change. The servants didn't dare approach. Even the cats, eternally darting across the courtyard, had disappeared. Something hung over the palace, and Cleopatra felt this was not time, this was premonition. She closed her eyes. In her memory surfaced the voice of a priestess from the temple of Isis, old, blind, but seeing the essence. She had once said, "There will be a man, not a lion and not an eagle, but a shadow. He will not give you a throne, but will leave a trace deeper than a crown. You will recognize him by his foot." Then Cleopatra had laughed. Now she could no longer. Behind her, a door creaked. She didn't turn around. The steps were soft, almost timid. She heard them not with her ears, with her skin. Her skin knew before consciousness. He had entered. Not a legate, not a dignitary, not a magician, simply a man. But what a man! He stopped a few steps away. Silence hung between them like a veil in a sanctuary. She turned around. First, a glance. Eyes dark, like obsidian in the temple of Ptah, not shining, absorbing. Then, hands. Gnarled, strong, with slight uncertainty in gestures, as if he didn't know whether he had the right to touch the air in her presence. But it wasn't the eyes, not the hands, that struck her. The foot. The sandal, ridiculously large, as if he had put on the shoes of someone else's giant. The strap was tied carelessly. The heel was worn. The foot, wide, masculine, like a blacksmith's, not a warrior's. And in this awkwardness, in this simplicity, was something wild, unadapted, real. Cleopatra looked at him not as a man, but as a revelation. He was not beautiful, he was different, without pretense, without challenge, without a crown. And for the first time in many years, she felt not power, but possibility. The possibility to be not a goddess, not a queen, not a priestess, but simply a woman, with cold feet on marble, with trembling in her fingers, with a nameless feeling that pulsed in her neck. "What is your name?" she asked. He raised his eyes, and there was no fear in them, no rapture, only calm, only presence. "Nobody," he answered. "I am merely a bearer of gifts." Cleopatra smiled, for the first time in a long while, not out of duty, not by calculation, but simply because her soul responded. Then she didn't know that this foot, this gaze, this name, nobody, would remain in her forever. That after emperors and gods, after triumphs and falls, after betrayal and glory, she would remember not Caesar, not Mark Antony, but him, the one who entered without ringing, the one who didn't stay, but didn't leave, the one whose shadow remained living under her skin. Chapter 2. A Heel Strike Against Fate. He entered the hall unnoticed. The servants paid no attention, someone else from the crowd, an escort without the right to speak, without a name. On such a day in the throne hall of Alexandria, diplomatic triumph reigned. Roman ambassadors, Syrian merchants, Greek poets, and Egyptian priests, all woven into a web of glances, bows, verbal reverences. Cleopatra sat on an elevation, not on a throne, on a semi-platform, among incense vapors, with eyes lowered slightly to the side. She had long learned to see without looking directly. That's how she first noticed him. He was holding a wooden box on which Poseidon's emblem was burned in gold. For a moment his foot stumbled and the box hit the marble. A light sound, as if someone had dropped fragile breath. No one reacted, only she. She raised her gaze. He bent down to adjust the box, and his tunic slipped slightly from his shoulder. Not the body, the action attracted her. And then her gaze dropped lower, to the sandal, large, not fitting the foot, or vice versa, the foot not fitting the world. Size 47. Her eyes lingered. It was funny, almost ridiculous, but for some reason she couldn't look away. In these worn straps, in the crooked curve of the heel, and how he seemed to hide his foot from the whole world, there was something human. And in this humanity, strength. She stood up, unexpectedly for herself. Everyone fell silent. Someone offered her fruit, someone a scroll. She walked past them, as if by chance, past him. He bowed, lowered his eyes. Everything according to protocol. Everything as taught. But at that moment she heard, within her hearing, a sound that no one else caught. He held his breath, and in this holding was trembling, not of fear, of presence. She stopped. Her voice was quiet, but everyone heard. "How does your foot not fall through the earth?" He didn't understand, or pretended not to understand. Slowly raised his head. His gaze met her eyes, for the first time. In this gaze there was neither submission nor pride, only peace. As if he lived near gods but never asked them for anything. "It keeps me on earth, Your Majesty," he answered. She nodded and walked on. But that evening, when everyone had dispersed, when she remained in her chambers among grapes and gentle wind from the sea, her fingers, sliding over the silk pillow, seemed to search for the texture of rough skin, heel, his. She remembered how this foot, huge and clumsy, stepped on her carpet with the image of Isis, how he almost stumbled and didn't apologize. He simply remained standing, straight, as if that's exactly how it should be. She didn't know his name, but already remembered the shape of his foot. This was not a man, a trace, an imprint in her memory. And it was impossible not to fall into this imprint. It was then, lying on the pillow, that she first thought, this man will enter her, not with his body, with presence, like a shadow, like a sign, like a heel strike against fate. Chapter 3. Words that were not. In the palace, everyone knew their place. Servant, shadow. Queen, light. Between them lay not steps of a staircase, but an abyss of rituals, boundaries, unwritten taboos. He knew this. She, even more so. That's exactly why he was silent. And that's exactly why she began to listen to this silence as to a new form of speech. He didn't say a word, only bowed, only waited, only brought a cup of wine, a dish of pomegranates, a vial of incense. He moved slowly, precisely, as if each movement was a prayer, and yet there was something stubborn in him. Not in actions, in breathing. His silence was not empty, it was thick, and it spoke, each day, louder. Cleopatra didn't ask questions. Why? She knew. If a word broke from her lips, it would destroy the delicate balance. And while they were silent, he looked down, she through him. Until the day when the handkerchief fell. She turned around. He was already nearby, before her maid could move. He picked up the fabric carefully, as if holding a heart, and extended it, not with a nod, not with a word, but with a gesture in which there was neither servility nor challenge, simply a hand. And at that moment, she touched his wrist. The skin under her fingers was warm, rough. He froze. A moment, a second. She felt how his palm tensed. But he didn't pull his hand away, didn't flinch, didn't allow himself the slightest gesture, and yet he didn't pull away. And in this non-movement was everything. Recognition, trust, silent yes that sounded louder than a scream. She squeezed his wrist a little tighter, not as a woman to a man, but as a person, to a sign. Her heart, trained for calculation, for betrayals, for balance between death and title, suddenly did what it hadn't done for many years. It exhaled. For the first time in a long while, she didn't think about Rome, about Syria, about politics. Only about this moment, about the wrist in her palm, about his breathing, which suddenly became quieter. He lowered his eyes, and she didn't let go. A few more heartbeats, and only then a step back, thin, almost imperceptible. She turned away first. He understood. He was not punished, not rejected, simply released, for now. From that day he began to come more often. By order or by whose will, no one knew. But now only he served the cup, and handkerchiefs no longer fell. But she always held it a bit carelessly, as if with expectation. They still didn't speak, but each glance, each gesture, each silence between them became like a phrase. She didn't know who he was, what his name was, how old he was, who his parents were, whether he was a warrior, slave, poet, or shepherd. She knew only one thing. Next to him, she was not only Cleopatra, not only the daughter of Isis. She was body, skin, heart. And in this silence, in this strange connection that had no words, was born what none of her intrigues knew, the desire not to rule, but to remain, not with herself, but with him, simply to be near, without a crown, without a name, without speech, only to be, only. Chapter 4. The first night with the one who should not have stayed. This didn't happen immediately. not against the backdrop of orgies and wines, not in the heat of passion, and not after long glances. This happened as it happens with prayer, pronounced not aloud, from the very depths of loneliness. The night was strangely quiet. The palace slept. Even the fountain in the inner courtyard seemed stopped. Servants sent away. Stars hung over the roof, as if someone had spilled salt on a black blanket. Cleopatra sat alone, without decorations, without perfume, in a simple white chiton which she hadn't worn since youth. She felt her body no longer belonged to the crown, only to herself, and to someone else. The one who should have disappeared but remained in her blood. She didn't send for him, didn't give an order, simply stood up and went out into the hall. There, in the shadow of columns, he stood, always nearby, always aside. She looked at him, not with challenge, not with expectation, simply with emptiness. And into this emptiness he entered, without words, without gestures, as if he had long been walking toward this moment, and knew that he would be let in. They found themselves in her chambers. The door didn't close, the air didn't tremble, he didn't breathe loudly, didn't hurry. There was a feeling that she and he were two rocks that had long stood side by side, simply hadn't touched yet. She sat on the edge of the bed. He stood. She didn't call, but didn't drive away. And then he approached, didn't fall to his knees, didn't reach out his hands, only lowered himself before her, to the floor, and placed his palm on her ankle, slowly, almost reverently, as if holding not a woman's leg, but the last truth in life. His fingers were warm, strong, without plea, without desire. Only presence. She didn't move. This was not love, not passion, not victory. This was sacrifice. Both understood. They were giving something important, not physical, internal. He, his silence. She, her armor. He didn't undress her, only touched skin, covered her foot with his palm. And at this point of connection, it was as if a ringing sounded, not with ears, but inside, soft, sad, like a bell for an unsent letter. When he lay down beside her, they didn't touch, only breathed, in one rhythm. She didn't cry, but something flowed inside. At that moment she understood. One could not be a queen in order to be a woman. A crown wasn't needed to be desired, and a name wasn't needed to be needed. In the morning he left like a shadow, leaving neither scent nor trace. Even the crease on the pillow disappeared. The servants said nothing. They were trained to be silent. But she knew this night would remain, like an imprint, like a touch, like a glance. This night was one, the only one, because to repeat it would mean to destroy it. And destroying, she knew how, but not this. He should not have stayed. He didn't stay. But since then, every evening, lying on silk and looking at the ceiling, she seemed to feel the light weight of a palm on her ankle, not as passion, but as an anchor that didn't let her drown in the bottomless sea of power. Chapter 5. Caesar's Arrival and the Death of Shadow. He arrived at dawn, to the noise of ships and boots. Alexandria was still breathing night coolness when purple fabrics were stretched on the pier and trumpets hummed over the palace. Caesar, a name spoken in half-voice but with the weight of a blow. Messengers ran through the streets, priests prepared temples, columns were rubbed with oil like a gladiator's body. He arrived not alone, he arrived with an epoch. Cleopatra stood at the window. She knew the moment had come, the one her teachers, her mother, her shadow had dreamed of. Rome had come, and with it the possibility not to survive, but to win. But victory always demands sacrifices, and this sacrifice had already been made last night, in body, in silence, in an ankle that her skin still remembered. Caesar entered her chambers like a temple, without fear, with dignity, and with the curiosity of a predator who had seen an equal for the first time. He didn't bow, he looked, and she answered, not with submission, not with coquetry, with strategy. This was a game. Chess between two gods, in which the stakes were peoples, borders, centuries. He was beautiful, not in face, in spirit. There was something inevitable in him. He didn't demand, he commanded with presence. He didn't convince, he breathed, and the air bowed by itself. When he spoke, walls stopped whispering. When he smiled, women's knees remembered weakness. She allowed him to enter, into her throne room, into her palace, into her mind, and gradually into her bed. But every night, even when he slept nearby, heavily, like a tired lion, her hand slid over the pillow, searching. Not something specific, simply shadow, the scent of skin, echo of someone else's breathing, a palm that had once lain on her ankle, like a seal. The servant disappeared. He no longer appeared. No one spoke his name. And was there one? Was he at all? Or had her consciousness, exhausted by power, invented a man with a huge foot and silent hands? She didn't ask, didn't search. In those days one couldn't look back. Rome slept nearby, and one had to be not a woman, an oracle, not a mistress, an ally, not a body, a state. And yet, when in the mornings she pressed her head to the pillow, there was still a barely perceptible scent preserved there. Incense and skin. It seemed to her that he had simply gone around the corner, that if she opened the door to the garden, he was there, in shadow, waiting, not demanding, simply existing. But she never opened the door. Not once. Caesar was magnificent, not tender, not attentive, but mighty and necessary. His embraces were like lightning, not caress, but force, and her body was accustomed to obeying necessity. It responded, smiled, served. Only the heart was silent, and in the heart's silence lived memories, those that were not given a name, those that came not in memories, but in touches of air. He disappeared, servant, ghost, bearer of gifts. But in Cleopatra's room forever remained a shadow that was impossible to sweep away. And this shadow lived in the fold of a sheet, in the curve of neck, in silence between breaths. Caesar became alliance, victory, history. But that one remained feeling. Chapter 6. Emperor and Priestess. Caesar loved sunrises. He rose early, before the first cries of seagulls, and drank wine, watching slowly awakening Alexandria. He said that only on the border of darkness and light could one feel power over the world. Cleopatra listened. She always knew how to listen to those who were useful. especially men on whose word borders depended. He taught her Latin expressions, showed tactics on maps, told how he dealt with enemies, how he subdued cities, how an army breathed. He made her an ally equal to himself, not a concubine, an equal. And this was new, intoxicating, dangerous. But at nights, when he fell asleep, turned on his side, when his breathing became heavy and slow, like a legion's step, Cleopatra lay with open eyes. Her body didn't sleep, not because it didn't want to, but because something in it found no response. It remembered something else. Not strength, the weight of a palm, not passion, silence between breaths. Not wine, roughness of skin on ankle. Caesar was a boulder. He covered, protected, conquered. He knew how to manage bodies, peoples, naval commanders, but he didn't know how to touch. His touches were precise, calculated, correct, almost military. They didn't give birth to trembling. They gave birth to admiration, but not desire. And that one, that other, his touches were like mistakes, wrong, rough, incomplete, but from this, real. As if he didn't know what he was doing, or knew but was afraid. And exactly in this fear was warmth, living, earthly. Sometimes Cleopatra looked at Caesar's hands, at strong fingers that pointed at maps, commanded, squeezed goblets, and suddenly remembered other fingers, uncertain, silent, those that once lingered on her skin a little longer than allowed. And in this extra moment was more honesty than in an entire Roman campaign. Caesar brought her power, recognition, status. He made her a symbol. He built temples in her honor. But more and more often she caught herself thinking she had already been a temple. When she lay with that one, without name, without thrones, simply body. She tried to erase this memory, like cauterizing a wound so it wouldn't fester. But the wound didn't heal. On the contrary, it became the foundation. Her body, trained for power, now refused to forget the taste of freedom. Caesar was emperor, she priestess, and everything of theirs was magnificent. But in this magnificence there was no place for the simple. To remain near, to be silent, to hold by the wrist, to listen to breathing. Sometimes she got up at night, barefoot, in one cloak, went to the balcony, looked at the harbor lights. There, where she first saw that one, where his sandals slipped from his foot, where she first felt awkwardness as a touch to the living. Now she had all of Rome, and in her chest, emptiness, not pain, not longing, simply an empty place which not even Caesar could enter. He knew how to fight, and that one, how to touch. Chapter 7. Silence after orgy. The hall was noisy as always. Romans didn't know how to drink quietly. They didn't converse, they gave speeches. Didn't eat, arranged rituals. Their laughter was wide, like their roads, and gesticulation, like legion movements. There were no half-tones here. Everything, either victory or death, either triumph or shame. Cleopatra sat on a cushion, half naked, with a goblet in her hand. Her body was motionless, but her gaze, constantly in movement. She observed, scanned, studied men as one studies maps before battle. Senators, poets, strategists, merchants, drunken philosophers. all worthy, trained, smoothly shaved, with genealogies, rings, and histories. But none of them moved like he did. She caught herself at this more and more often. Gait, a trifle. But in it, in this uncertain, slightly swaying gait, was something that none of these men could allow themselves. Forgetfulness of their own greatness. He walked as if he didn't know that someone was watching him, as if he wasn't part of the spectacle, as if he was himself. In the noise of feasts, she began to be bored. Not for body, for silence. For that silence that was between her and him, where names didn't sound, where decorations weren't required, where everything was simple. Step, glance, pause. When one of the senators, with wine on his lips and a joke on his tongue, fell at her feet, she involuntarily laughed, not from joy, from memory. Her mind threw up an image. How then, at the stairs, he slipped. The sandal slid from his heel and he almost fell. No grace, no preparation. But in this was sublime, true, awkwardness not masked by bravado, mistake not hidden behind a mask. She then laughed, not as a queen, but as a girl. He raised his eyes and smiled for the first time, barely noticeably, and this smile was the most honest thing she had seen in her life. Now, hundreds of faces, hundreds of speeches, hundreds of touches that demanded response. But her skin no longer responded, only twitched where his palm had once lain, and in every fold of dress, in every glance, she felt how everything in her resisted the present. After orgies, silence always comes, and this silence was more terrible. In it, not emptiness. In it, memory. Not about a night of love, about a day when his sandal slipped. And she thought, if God exists, he is in this awkwardness, in honesty of moment, in disproportionality of body and world. Around they feasted, shouted, clapped, offered. And she sat, drank diluted wine, and listened to silence, that very one that remained from him. Sometimes in the crowd someone turned around, and her heart compressed, hope that it was him, but it never was. He disappeared. Forever? Probably. But more and more often, it seemed to her, he simply stood in doorways, just behind a column, waiting. Wouldn't enter, wouldn't call, simply stood. And silence, this was him. This very silence after orgy. Chapter 8. The first crack in Caesar's marble. This happened not in battle, not in argument, not in politics, not in those moments when men usually break. This happened in the morning, in the hall where they discussed a treaty with governors from Asia. They lingered. One of them allowed himself mockery, and at that moment Cleopatra saw for the first time how Caesar clenched his fist. Not for defense, not from desire, from anger, pure like ash, anger. Without words, without explanations, the flesh of his palm turned white. And this fist became a revelation for her. She understood. He squeezed, not himself, the world, people, her. He was used to taking, used to holding, used to squeezing so it would hold. And in this was greatness, Roman strength, not declining, not yielding, not knowing boundaries. But she was not an empire, she was a woman. And at that moment when he furiously spoke about how he would punish insolent messengers, Her gaze slid over his face and found no understanding there, only will, only purpose. He didn't feel her breathing, didn't notice when her voice trembled, didn't hear pauses between words, didn't see how her pupil contracted when she heard about crucifying slaves. And that one would have seen. That one noticed the slightest fluctuation in tone, understood when she was tired, even if she smiled, retreated if he felt fear, and was near when silence came inside. Caesar elevated her, made her a goddess, priestess, symbol. He lifted her into legend. But she suddenly understood. From height you can't hear whispers. And she so wanted to be heard. She remembered how then, in the hall, that one said not a word when she lost her breath, simply put his hand on her back, not firmly, not intrusively, simply was, without demand, without control. Caesar couldn't be otherwise. He kept everything under control, even her breathing, even her silence. He thought he knew her, but did he? That night she didn't approach him, didn't embrace, simply lay on the edge of the bed, listened to how he slept, how his chest rose in the rhythm of a victor, and her heart beat in the rhythm of emptiness. She understood. To be great doesn't mean to be loved. Her face was on coins, her name in chronicles, her body in the emperor's embraces. But where was she herself? The next morning she stood before a mirror, saw in reflection a woman, in gold, in decorations, with eyes tired from light, and suddenly remembered shadow. Shadow of the one who didn't demand, didn't squeeze, didn't elevate. Shadow that simply stood near, listened, was. And then she understood. The first crack appeared in Caesar's marble. Her heart. Heard this earlier, chapter 9, the letter that was not. The night stood windless. Lamps flickered unevenly, as if reflecting her doubts. The moon seemed not silver, but dull yellow, like a bar of soap forgotten in the sky. Everything was too quiet, even for a palace accustomed to her silence. Cleopatra sat alone, in a room where she usually received only the closest. Today there was neither Caesar nor servants here, only she, and a cypress table, and nearby papyrus, new, perfectly smooth, like an unborn thought. She didn't know why she had ordered it brought. It was spontaneous, sudden, like a call of blood. She looked at the clean surface and felt her heart ache, quietly, almost tenderly, like a memory from which you can't get rid. The word didn't want to lie first. She took the stylus, turned it, ran her finger over it, as if waiting for it to prompt. And suddenly a phrase flashed in her head, simple, without pathos, without power. You were more real than all gods. It seemed to her that this was the main thing, the only thing worth saying. He, with his size 47, with a crooked strap on his sandal, with eyes full of peace. He was real. Real in a world where even gods were molded from propaganda and gold. She imagined the letter would find him by some miracle. A servant, fisherman, wind, someone would deliver it. He would unseal, read, and what? Smile, erase, forget? Or not recognize? She squeezed her fingers. The papyrus trembled. She felt fear, not before Rome, not before enemies, before a memory that might crumble if named. Sometimes one word is enough for illusion to disappear. And what if he was no longer the same? or worse, had never been. Maybe everything that lived in her was her own invention. Fatigue? Desire for the simple? Maybe she had invented him. She threw down the stylus. There would be no letter, not because she didn't want to, but because she couldn't. Because some feelings are stronger than paper, deeper than words. They can only be kept like an altar, like a secret. To open means to destroy. She stood up, approached the window. There below, Alexandria slept. The sea whispered something of its own, eternal. A light wind touched her cheek, and in this touch it seemed to her, this was him, his breath, his palm, his silence. She closed her eyes. You were more real than all gods, she repeated mentally, and then opened and crumpled the papyrus. The letter would not be written, because he wouldn't read it, or, what was worse, would read and forget. Chapter 10. The Last Dream Before the Snake. The night was predictable. Everything was already decided. Letters sent, doors closed, servants dismissed. No one argued, no one cried. Everything happened slowly, as if death itself didn't want to hurry, so as not to disturb the Great One. Cleopatra lay on the bed, naked, as on the day of her birth. Her body didn't hide, neither from gods nor from the past. Only thin silk, almost weightless, spread over her thigh like a reminder she was still here, still breathing, but not for long. The room resembled a tomb before it became one. The air was thick like honey, light, dim, like the gaze of a dying candle. Everything in it knew this was the end. But she wasn't afraid. She closed her eyes. Caesar didn't come, neither in memory nor in dreams. His voice, loud, decisive, became alien. His touches, distant, like a war that was long forgotten. Neither Rome, nor power, nor even the throne, none of this entered with her into her last night. He entered, not in body, in dream, without noise, without promises, simply was. As she remembered him, in tunic, simple fabric, not military, not royal. There was no sandal, barefoot, as if everything that connected him to the world remained behind the door of her consciousness. He walked, limping slightly, and in this crooked gait was more truth than in any triumphs. He approached her unhurriedly and dropped to his knees. She felt his presence as one feels water, not with eyes, but with skin. He didn't speak, only extended his hand and touched her forehead. Carefully, as one touches an icon, his fingers were warm, living, real. She opened her eyes, inside the dream, looked at him. His face was the same as then, without age, without makeup, without status, only gaze, that very one. And then she whispered, "If anyone was God, it was you." He nodded, not in agreement, in understanding, as if he himself didn't believe, but knew, for her, yes. And then the snake, hidden in a basket at the head of the bed, stirred. Its black body slid across the floor like a drop of night. Cleopatra didn't flinch. She only smiled, calmly, like a woman who had chosen and was not chosen. The poison bit into skin under her breast. Heat went through veins. But this was not fear. This was completion. Completion of a path she had walked, not as a ruler, but as a living being. Before her heart stopped, she once more saw him, standing in the doorway of her mind, silent, real, the only one. He was not God. He was more real. And when everything else left, titles, legions, gold, intrigues, Caesar, only one thing remained: memory.